I can look at people, look at their eyes, and tell how much marijuana they are smoking.
Where them kicks at? Where them hands? Where them holes? Where them throws? You know what I'm saying? Cecil.
This is why I train in martial arts. This take or reaction to marijuana use is going to sound really, really out there to anybody who hasn't had similar experiences. And it's going to be, I'm basically going to tell you why I'm against marijuana use. And yet another reason why I train in martial arts. In a nutshell, I think it's a bunch of people walking around high and or brain damage from using bad marijuana. So I'm going to have to keep my technique up in order to be able to combat against it, especially as I get older. It probably won't even really show up until I'm in my 70s. God willing, I live that long. Another thing is, speaking of marijuana, you're not smoking marijuana. Some of you think you're smoking cannabis, but you're smoking some kind of genetically modified, freaky, mutant thing. That's not real cannabis. It's not the natural cannabis. It's not what I saw people smoking when I was a child during the 70s. I didn't need the following clips I'm going to borrow and put in here. I didn't need those to tell me that. I could look and see that whatever people are smoking now is not what I saw people smoking when I was growing up. This is some kind of new weird stuff. Also, some people are, I call it allergic to marijuana, meaning they're going to have a reaction to it that's so bad that they could become violent. And I've seen that also happen with alcohol, but I think it's probably worse with marijuana. Plus, back to my point of you're not even smoking marijuana. They like to put all this other stuff in it, all these other drugs. You're gonna put stimulants in there and all these other chemicals in there, or you're gonna modify what you're growing to the point where it's not marijuana. Even if it smells like marijuana or it tastes like marijuana, it looks like marijuana, it's not marijuana. It's something that's going to send you to the psych ward, or it's something that's going to have you kill someone else. So I'm not arguing right or wrong. I'm not arguing moral. I'm arguing from a self-defense standpoint. I think things are going to get to the point where marijuana use is dangerous. Then society's going to go, I can't believe it's so bad. When we're being warned now, marijuana use is going to impair your ability to learn a martial art because it affects your brain function and it affects your memory. Now, there are probably going to be martial artists who are going to look at this video and say, I smoke marijuana and it does nothing to me. It helps me. It's how I learned to use nunchucks or something, whatever. Or you're going to think that I hate you because you may happen to smoke marijuana. No, that's not it at all. A lot of times if people smoke marijuana and they're actually an adult and they started when they were an adult, it doesn't have the same effect on them that it does people who are children and even people who are in their 20s and 30s. So let's take a listen, and you're going to see it's not just Cecil saying this stuff.
But I'm speaking as a physician and as a psychiatrist who has seen the effect of chronic marijuana use. And marijuana in our textbooks in psychiatry and in medicine does alter functioning.
Also, today's weed is about 4 times as strong as it was 30 years ago.
Oh. Such that I can look at people, look at their eyes, and tell how much marijuana they are smoking. And it interferes with brain functioning. It affects memory. It affects people's ability to learn and to think coherently.
The DEA continues to refuse to schedule marijuana at a lower schedule. It's still considered a Schedule 1 drug. However, recently, they decided to schedule synthetic marijuana produced by a pharmaceutical company as a Schedule 2 drug, even though this drug has side effects that you wouldn't experience if you used marijuana. Now, it's known as Syndrose. It's a liquid marijuana substitute that contains a synthetic version of the marijuana ingredient that makes users feel high, THC, and has been assigned a less restrictive drug category than real marijuana. So the liquid is developed by Arizona-based pharmaceutical company Insys Therapeutics, the company behind synthetic opioid fentanyl.
So let's begin to break this down. So they made weed worse. So the government's like, oh, but you're a corporation. Great, you have a lot more rights than human beings. So now we're going to make this less illegal than actual marijuana, which is actually safer.
A variation of the gene called AKT1 is linked to people being more susceptible to the mind-altering effects of cannabis. For the study, the researchers tested 442 marijuana users for psychotic-like symptoms while they were high, then again about a week later when they were sober. The researchers measured the extent of the symptoms and effects on memory loss and compared results. They found that the study participants with a certain variant of the AKT1 gene had a much stronger reaction to cannabis, including symptoms like paranoia, magical thinking, and visual distortions than their counterparts. Oftentimes on the show, we have very positive coverage when it comes to marijuana legalization. So a few of our viewers were concerned when a new study came up indicating that cannabis use could have some negative consequences, okay? And I think it's only fair that we cover that story as well. Now, this is regarding a 20-year study that was published in the scientific journal Addiction. And the reason why this is a very relevant study is because obviously it's a long-term study. It started in the early 1990s. And what they wanted to look at is whether or not there's been any type of changes in the type of marijuana and whether or not it has negative or adverse health consequences for people who smoke it regularly. Now, first of all, let me note that the majority of studies that were done on marijuana that were credible happened in the 1970s. And two things have changed since then, okay? So I'm gonna tell you those two things. Recreational cannabis use has become almost as common as tobacco use among adolescents and young adults, which means there are simply more weed smokers to study. So that's relevant. And also today's weed is about 4 times as strong as it was 30 years ago. Oh. So the research still shows that you can't overdose on cannabis. In 1993, the evidence indicated that the risk of a fatal overdose from using cannabis was extremely small. That's still true. The amount of marijuana required to trigger an overdose is somewhere between 15 and 70 grams, which is a far greater amount of cannabis that even a very heavy cannabis user could use in a day. Again, it's something that we already knew, all right? A meta-analysis found that recent cannabis use indicated by THC in blood or self-reported cannabis use doubled the risk of a car crash. So the study says 1 in 6 people who start using cannabis regularly in adolescence develops a dependency, compared with around 1 in 10 who start using it as adults. Increasingly sophisticated studies since 1993 have consistently found deficits in verbal learning, memory, and attention in regular cannabis users. These effects on IQ were found only in the small proportion of cannabis users who initiated in adolescence and persisted in daily use throughout their 20s and into their 30s.
Weed made me paranoid. I've been paranoid. Yeah, weed. That's a bad high story. Every time I smoke weed, that's a bad high. That's why I don't smoke.
What might a paranoid person with a knife or a gun do to you?
That sativa strains can be useful in treating depression and mood disorders, ADHD, and fatigue. In contrast, cannabis indica is typically reported as being more relaxing or sedating. People tend to describe it as producing more of a body high in contrast to the mental high that sativa gives you. And it's claimed that indica strains are useful at treating these things, everything from anxiety and chronic pain to inflammation and low appetite. But again, I want to emphasize that the human cultivators that have been working hard for many years now have sort of blurred the lines between these different species, and there's so many different strains and substrains now that it's very difficult to predict what the exact effects, both psychoactive and medicinal, will be for any given strain of marijuana.
We could not determine actually the specific effects on adolescents. Evidence from other substances would suggest, other substances being tobacco and alcohol, that it would be prudent not to have adolescents using cannabis because they are particularly vulnerable to the effects of psychoaffective agents.
So we actually have been studying the impact of recreational marijuana use for more than 20 years. And for the last 2.5, the effects of medical marijuana use. And you're absolutely right. It's very important to distinguish between the two. Most of what we know about the impact of marijuana on the brain comes from studies of recreational marijuana users, primarily those with chronic heavy use. Overall, as Marie mentioned, studies typically report differences or impairments, if you will, in cognitive function across a number of domains in those who use marijuana compared to those who don't. In our work, we've noted that the most striking differences are actually among those with what we call early onset marijuana use, that is, use prior to, in our studies, the age of 16, compared to those who begin using later, particularly on tasks requiring what we call executive functions. These are things like the ability to utilize feedback to change your behavior or to inhibit inappropriate responses. This is perhaps not surprising, since the brain continues to develop throughout the second and maybe even into the third decade of life, and adolescence into early adulthood, as Marie alluded to, represents a period of what we call neurodevelopmental vulnerability. Increased frequency and magnitude of use has also been shown to be associated with worse performance, and to date, we have very little data on the potential impact of what we consider higher potency products.
So the marijuana is more potent. The minds using it are young. They're not fully formed yet. And in case you don't know, crime tends to start in adolescence. It spikes in adolescence and doesn't taper off until people get in about their 30s. Then it starts to go down. If you've ever studied data on when people tend to commit most crimes, it's younger people past puberty rebelling against the society. And you want to add dangerous marijuana to the mix. So again, I'm not arguing right or wrong. I'm sure if you're talking from a self-defense standpoint, I don't hate you if you smoke it, but I am going to say this. If you smoke it, it can impair your ability to learn and use your martial art because you may forget stuff or your brain just can't assimilate it so that you can use it. And think about this. What if you're not allergic to it, but somebody else is? You use it. Next to this person, they have a violent reaction to it, freak out, and the next thing you know, you're a little drowsy and impaired from the drug, which has a calming effect on you, but has a very volatile and violent effect on someone else. So that's why I'm not going along with this whole, hey, pot is cute movement. I don't think it's cute. It's not the same stuff that I saw before, and I think things are going to get worse. So as long as things are getting worse, study a martial arts so that you can protect yourself. Like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching the video. Please share this video so we can get another viewpoint out there. And peace.